Anne Curzan. And Anne did I first met Anne in St. Petersburg at the ACES conference there. She was our keynote speaker and a wonderful talk. And so we're going to sort of continue that. And for those of you who don't know her, she's, as I said, a dean at University of Michigan, which I would think would take most of her time, but she still does some things with linguistics, and every week she does a show on Michigan Public Radio, a short discussion on the radio about words with a variety of topics. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and get to be with people who care about words and punctuation and all those sorts of things as much as I do.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that's definitely our audience. So, so first of all, you keep your finger on the pulse of language change and language issues. So, so let's start off with the most important thing. What are your thoughts on the New York Times puzzles taking over Wordle?
So, I have done Wordle. And I don't do it every day because I'm a little worried that I will just get addicted, and that we have to try to avoid that. But I think it's really clever. And one of the things that I love about Wordle is that for me, it captures how much almost everyone, if not everyone, enjoys language. And it's what makes my job so fun to be a linguist and an English professor who thinks about language, is that you can engage almost anybody on these topics, because this is what we do for fun, is puzzle out words. Right.
Do people geek out when you're at a event or a social gathering or whatever, and then people must come up to you and say, "Oh my gosh, you're a linguist, and I've heard you on the radio," and what's that like, that reaction?
Well, I sometimes tell this story. People have two reactions to me if we were to lump them into two general categories. So when they find out what I do, and the first is actually to stop talking. This sort of, oh, you're an English professor, you're a linguist, you are going to hear, and they'll use this kind of language. You're going to hear all my mistakes. You probably think I don't use the language right. And then they stop talking and try to go find someone else to talk to. I also have people at the university who will say, "Anne, I spend more time on an email to you than anyone else. Like, I go over it and over it and over it," which is so funny to me because, of course, I'm the person who is delighting in language change, who finds the whole range of the language interesting, from informal to formal. I think if you were going to, use less standard grammar or have a typo, like, I'm the person. You're okay with me. The other reaction is one of a kind of excitement or glee when people meet me, because people do care about language and they have things they want to talk with me about. I will say most of the time it is in the peeve category. Make them stop doing that. Or it really bothers me when I hear this. What do you think about that? Sort of hoping that I'm going to affirm the peeve, that there's something wrong with it. And for me, this is great fun, because this is when I get to, person by person, 1 inch at a time, try to help people think about some of those peeves differently. That this is actually variation and change in progress. It's usually really interesting. And so I love engaging in those conversations.
So here's the thing. I love those conversations too, but actually it's interesting because I often feel like that's when I come across as a bit of a crank, because you're disagreeing with people. People say, "This is my peeve," and you say, "Well, yeah, but and you sort of give them sort of the story of usage. I mean, is it a difficult conversation to deal with people who have peeves?
So that's a great question, Mark. I don't think anyone's ever asked it in quite that way, of like, do you sound like a crank when you're being descriptive in the face of peeve? I try not to. The first thing that has been really important to me as I have been talking with people about peeves one by one and in large group settings, which I do, is to acknowledge that I have my own peeves, And I think that that is one of those really important places to establish some shared ground, which is, I notice things and I think, ugh, does the language really have to change that way? Couldn't it change some other way? And the example that I've used for a long time is impactful, which I just really don't like that word. Now, I see many people nodding. So I have friends who also do not like this word. Now, I don't have very good grounds for not liking that word. It is formed exactly like meaningful and hopeful. It's fine. It's just newer. And for whatever reason, aesthetically, I find it displeasing. But I recently found myself in a conversation here at the university saying something like, and I think that change is going to be very, and I realized I was walking straight up to using impactful. Like I was on the precipice and I took a right turn and I said something like significant, but I thought I should just get over this, and I will. And actually the radio show just this past Sunday was about the metaphorical use of double click. And so, with a computer, we double click on a folder or a program, and it is a way to go deeper or look at something in more detail. It is now used often in business jargon as a way to talk about diving in deeper or going into more detail, is we're going to double click on that. And I became aware of this because a colleague of mine in the business school here uses this term all the time. It is his transition between PowerPoint slides. So you have a PowerPoint slide, you've got a topic on the PowerPoint slide. He said, okay, so we're going to double click on that, and then we go to the next slide. And my initial response was a kind of like, oh, that feels so jargony to me. And so I went home and I said to my partner, oh, double click, it's so jargony. And he said, actually, I think it's quite clever.
That's the trouble with jargon. It can be clever. Yeah.
It can be clever. And I stepped back and I thought, now, Anne, get over yourself. It actually is. It is really clever as a kind of jargon. And so it's a long way of saying that I think the first thing is to say, we all have bits of language that we notice, and our first reaction may be one of annoyance or not liking it. And so one of the things I talk with people about is I talk about it as our inner grammando. So grammando was a term that was coined by Lizzie Skernick in the New York Times Magazine of this should be a word. And a grammando is somebody who corrects other people's word choice and grammar. And so I talk about it as managing our inner grammandos, which is to acknowledge that you have one. And then the question is, what do you do with that voice? So when that voice, I don't like this, or do you correct someone, or do you have a conversation with your inner grammando about how well-founded this peeve is, and should it just stay inside your head as opposed to going outside your head? So that's been one way that I've come at that question. Right.
Interesting. If people have questions, anything about linguistics, ask them, put the query in the room chat. We'll try to get to you, because I'm thinking some people have come here with questions. Zoom bombers, please just to go off to the next Zoom. That would be helpful. So you've been doing the show on Michigan radio. And I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. What's the name of the show?
The show is called That's What They Say.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. That's What They Say. How long have you been doing it now? It's been quite a while.
Yeah, so it started in 2012.
Yeah, okay.
So 5 minutes at a time.
Right,
I started with 3 minutes. For those of you who listen to NPR, you know that on Sunday morning, you have Will Shortz doing the puzzle. Exactly, so I got some thumbs up for Will Shortz doing the puzzle. So he does it at 8:35 and 10:35. At least here in Michigan. And at 9:35, there is an open spot for local programming. So I get the little spot in between the hours that Will Shortz is doing the puzzle to do what is now between 4 and 5 minutes of language. And so we'll take 1 or 2 language questions, like double click, and talk about the history of it. And I will say, now we have a huge long queue of questions from listeners. So no shortage of topics, because people email us every week with, what's going on with this? What's going on with that? And there are always new topics in there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, the question. So I left Michigan in 2005. I used to listen to Michigan radio in Grand Rapids. so I haven't actually heard that, but it is on the web, of course. You can go and watch all the episodes in there, 5 minutes long, right? So it's easy to get through. So do you have out of all those every week? So that's like, well, you're going on 10 years, 500 episodes, right? You're probably approaching 500 episodes. What's your favorite?
Honestly, Mark, I probably, it's going to be the one I remember, right? So a recent one.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me because someone will email now and say, have you talked about this? And I will go back in the archive because I'll be like, I think we did talk about that one. And I have to go back and, be from 2013 or 2014. Yeah. I always love doing the word of the year. That's that every, the beginning of January, we always do one on what won the word of the year for the American Dialect Society. And this year it meant that I got to talk about, hilarious words like chin diaper, which I have to say is one of my favorite new acquisitions to describe the mask worn here rather than over one's mouth. So I have adopted that into my vocabulary.
I can't remember, was that a category winner or just a nominee?
It was a runner-up. It actually didn't win, which I thought was really too bad because, but hard pants, which is also one of my favorites.
I never heard that before. Yeah.
So that one most useful. And for those of you, hard pants being a retronym that was created in contrast to soft pants, which is what most people have been wearing during the pandemic, sweatpants, yoga pants. And then there was this question of, do I really have to go back to work and put on hard pants with zippers and belts and all of those kinds of things?
So those are the fun ones. What was did you have a choice for word of the year out of the finalists?
Well, so the word of the year from American Dialect Society was insurrection, which I think is an interesting choice because obviously January 6th is something that defined 2021 in a lot of ways, and certainly as we ended the year was something we were thinking about in terms of what was happening in Congress. And the question of what to call what happened on January 6th was part of processing January 6th. There was a lot of energy from dictionaries around vaccine, vax, and I get that as well. And those were kind of runners up in the word of the year category, because of course, 2021 was also a big part of that, was about getting vaccines for COVID-19 and a lot of creativity around something like vax, anti-vax, vaxxers, anti-vaxxers. And I will say many people noted that they can hardly wait until vax spelled with 2 X's is in the Scrabble dictionary so that it can become a Scrabble word.
Yes. Do you see that happening? I don't know. It is very.
I think it will happen. I think it will happen. Yeah.
Yeah. I do see it an awful lot. And I don't think it's people sort of just being fun, having fun with it. I think people spell vaxxed. I don't know. I'm trying to think what else is a double X construction like that. But I've seen it a lot with the double X. And of course, there's so many words that are plays on vax. So that was my choice. I liked the vaccine variations. I thought the insurrection was an interesting sort of something I hadn't considered or thought about before, but in relation to the January 6th. So did you go to the Zoom with the word of the year for?
I did. I was absolutely at the Zoom. We had been hoping to do it in person in DC that first week of January. And then like so many other things, it got moved online. So I got to participate online. I will say for the American Dialect Society, I've been going almost since we started voting on the word of the year in 1990. And I've been going to American Dialect Society since about 94 or 95. And it's grown in size so that it started with about 40 people in a room. And by 2019, or 2020, it was about 400 people in a room. And we were still counting votes by hand. So you had Ben Zimmer in the front on a stage, and you had counters who were taking quadrants of this hotel ballroom. And they'd be like, who wants this? And people would raise their hand, and people would raise 2 hands. And, the counters are trying to count. It was a very approximate vote count. And so I will say that on Zoom, it is nice to feel like you're actually, when you get the poll and people vote, and then you can see the results of the vote, that the vote might actually reflect what had happened.
Right. Right.
I think that is an improvement.
Yeah, and that's what, and people say, they like the opportunity to be able to actually go from wherever they are and participate in it. So maybe that's something that we'll see more of in the future. But it's a lot of fun. If you've never done the ADS Word of the Year, if it happens, if there is an online virtual component next year, show up. It's really interesting. It's a lot of fun. So let me just get back to the show. Do we get an answer on your favorite episode? I don't think we did.
Really, I have to say,
you ducked the question brilliantly.
I did duck the question, but I have to say, one of the things for me is that we get a lot of topics, and I will dig into most of them, and not all of them get on the air, because for me it is, am I excited enough about this to do a good 5 minutes on it? And there are things that people will ask about, and I just think, it's not going to be interesting enough on the radio. So I try to make sure that every week it's something that I'm actually think is cool enough to get on the radio. Now, I will say, sometimes listening to us try to get around quote unquote bad words, because this is NPR and we have is an entertaining feat, is to watch us, the circumlocution that we go through to be able to talk about something without talking about it.
Yeah, and on that word chat, we've done 2 or 3 episodes just on bad words, so we don't have any compunction about that. But people do laugh at me when I use them. Is there a in terms of the popularity of the radio show, are there certain topics that you find just really resonate with people, that you get lots of people going to the website to download?
I think certainly, if you talking about things like texting is always interesting to people. Anytime I talk about singular they, and this is true on the radio, and this is true in print, the appetite for that is endless at the moment, from what I can tell. So I did an editorial in the Washington Post in October on singular they. And I've been advocating singular they for 25 years. I mean, this is not new to me. And the arguments that I'm making are not new. And yet you put it in the post, and there are thousands of comments. I mean, people just go crazy when you bring up singular they, and rehearse in some ways the same arguments over and over again. We will get through it. But it's really, and I would much rather engage. I mean, I'm delighted that people want to engage on it, and that's how this change will get accepted. And I was talking to someone the other day who self-identified as a grammando. And one of the arguments that I made in the Post piece is about, for non-binary they, is that fundamentally this is about respect. And that to respect a person is to respect their pronouns. And the analogy that I made is names. And I have found that it is one of the ways that I can get through is I say, if somebody said to you, my name is Michael, but I go by Paul, and you said, well, I'm still going to call you Michael, or, I'm going to call you Andy, because that is easier for me. That would be a very weird response, and clearly a very rude and disrespectful response. And when someone says my pronoun is they, and you say, that's too hard for me, I'm sorry, I can't do that. It's the same thing, is to say I don't care enough to try. And it doesn't mean that you might not make mistakes, because you may make mistakes, but that's different from saying I think that's silly, or I shouldn't have to do that.
Right. So let's talk about the status of singular they. Now, the Washington Post famously decided it was okay. You don't have to jump through hoops to avoid singular they. And specifically, and I say the Washington Post because that's where your article was. And they were one of the first, I think, big organizations to say, yeah, this is okay. In terms of people's personal preference as a pronoun, that was something that they said, Bill Walsh wrote the guidelines that said, we're gonna do that because that's respectful. And we've had, and that was a few years ago, AP, Associated Press has, 2015, the Associated Press, Style Book, Chicago Manual of Style, they both adopted it to a point. Some people would like them to embrace it more. APA in the most recent edition has, more fully embraced it. It must be interesting as a linguist to sort of, you've been advocating for 25 years, but really in the past 5 to 7 years, it's really sort of, we've seen a shift, I think.
We have, absolutely. And it is fascinating to me for many reasons. One of which is it didn't happen the way I was expecting it to, which I love. The driver. So I've been advocating for gender neutral singular they for years, because that's the old form. That's what we've got hundreds of years of usage on this. Shakespeare, Jane Austen, right? I mean, you can, and this would be, someone who knows where they're going, someone who knows where they're going, or we want to thank the anonymous reviewer for their comments. So gender unknown, gender irrelevant, gender neutral. So that they has been around a long time. And that's what I've been advocating for, to say they can be singular. It is singular. We should be able to do this in writing. What has driven the change is non-binary singular they. And that's what I wasn't expecting. But what you started to see happen, and why the Post shifted in 2015, was out of respect for people for whom non-binary they is their pronoun. And so then the gender neutral they is getting to come along as a byproduct of accepting non-binary they. So, for me, it's all good. However it happens, it's all good. But it's an interesting motivation that has caused the style guides to finally shift.
Right. I think I've heard this going back years. I think there was probably a point in my life where I never even thought of they as a non-binary term. It just wasn't something that I had thought about or considered. So it is amazing how quickly that's come in. But I know I've had conversations going back years with editors and English teachers who said, I wish we would just adopt singular and get it over with and not have to worry about this anymore. So it's a great.
And what's so interesting to me, there are many things that I find useful about that rule, one of which is that with the singular they rule, you can pinpoint its origins. And that is because it got naturalized for so long that there was something wrong with singular they. To be able to go back to the mid-18th century and Anne Fisher's grammar book and say, this is the first recorded instance that we have of someone saying that you should use generic he, and that he encompasses everybody, so it's fine. And then Lindley Murray, 1795, picks up the rule in his grammar book, which sold, it was a bestseller, went through something like 18 editions. And in Lindley Murray's grammar book, I actually had this in the Washington Post editorial and they made me take it out because they said it was too confusing. But his example sentence uses singular they, and he crosses it out and puts he. So that Lindley Murray was well aware that people were using singular they, and he was trying to correct them and say, no, you have it wrong. It should be he. And then for almost 200 years, we got stuck with this because Lindley Murray in his best-selling grammar crossed out they and put he, and then it got picked up. So by Strunk and White, it says things like singular he is never incorrect. You're like, right. I don't know.
And people, and I've heard people recently advocate for that, and it seems so such an anachronism now when people say, "Well, he's a universal pronoun."
I would agree.
No, yeah. So I have one more question. So I want to talk about one thing about a gendered language. Then we have some questions from the room, but the question I have is, and I struggle with this a little bit, is the idea of manned for people who man hours, people who work, manned aircraft. I think a big one comes in with, we have drones now, or they're unmanned aircraft. Well, they don't have to be men in them, obviously. I mean, a lot of I think that change is not as necessarily accepted to say uncrewed. I think a lot of people push back on that and say, man is a universal idea. What's your take on that?
Again, this is something I've studied, and what I'm struck by is actually how fast change has happened here. So in fact, most man words, suffixed man words, are no longer part of common usage, both in print and in spoken language. And that's what, like, the COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English Database, shows. So something like flight attendant is now the term. And I have to say, instead of now that's not a man word, but steward, stewardess, you still have these gendered terms. When flight attendant, and I'm old enough to remember when flight attendant came in, I thought, that doesn't have a prayer. That is the clunkiest thing I have ever, like, flight attendant.
It is, yeah.
And yet we now say flight attendant. And in fact, I can't remember the name of the song, but there is a song that has flight attendant in the lyrics, which props to them. But we talk about firefighters, we talk about mail carriers, police officers. And what's striking about those is that I think early on, there was an attempt to do person words, like a fire person. And for the most part, they just didn't work. They were clunky. And so what you see is a whole range of options: police officer, firefighter, mail carrier. We have a couple, like spokesperson is one of the person words that's still there, but chair of a department instead of a chairman.
Yeah. I can remember chair, a lot of pushback, and I felt like you call somebody a chair, you're calling them a piece of furniture.
Right, but now
it's pretty,
now that is, totally standard here at the university, is that you have the chair. Now, the one that I am struck has not, we've actually changed our style guide here in the college, but actually it has not changed at the university yet, is freshman. So we no longer use freshman in the college, we use first year student. I have had people say, but that ruins the progression. And I think, what progression? Right? I mean, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, the progression's already screwed up. So and I will say that is now completely natural to me to say a first year seminar, first year students, it's a first year class. So we have these little pockets, but we have found workarounds in a surprisingly short period of time.
Okay, let's go to a question from the room.
Yes, we have one from Christian. Christian, if you want to unmute.
Hi, Anne. First time, long time. My question is, what's been one of your most surprising revelations when unearthing the etymology or original usage of a familiar word and phrase?
What a good question. Okay, so I'm going to give you two, because one, so ampersand, which some of you may know, which comes from and per se and. The more devastating one was the origins of old hat, as in that's old hat, which I no longer use. I now cannot remember why I looked this up, but I wrote a blog post for the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I used to blog for Lingua Franca, and I wrote a blog post on it. It is sexual in origins. It is derogatory toward women, as a way of saying she's old hat. And I will leave you to think about what it might mean in that context. but I no longer use this phrase because its origins are pretty awful.
I had no idea, and I think last I checked, the Lingua Franca blog posts were still available. Are they? Or are they taking it down by now?
The blog stopped in 2018,
Yeah.
and they weren't available for a while. I think they're available, but for subscribers only. They're not easy to find, I think, which I'm bummed about,
Right.
because there's so much good content
Yes.
in there from all the bloggers. I mean, it was such a good group of bloggers. And so we sometimes email them to say, can you make sure that those are available?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we'll do the research, and we'll see if we can find a link to them if they are available. But yeah. So there was a question just sort of generally asked in the room. We were talking about singular they. What about themselves, and what do we do with that?
So themself is out there,
Mhm.
and I think we should let it happen. It makes complete sense that with they as a singular pronoun, that you could have themselves. Okay, now I'm going to go on one of my other riffs. I haven't done this with themselves yet, but I'm going here.
Okay, good.
Is that
We're recording it.
we could and can tolerate more variation than most copy editors allow. We live in what I now have come to refer to as a hyper standardized language world, where we are trying to stamp out all variation. So there's sort of the sense of it should either be themselves or themselves if you have a singular they, and it really could be both, and we would be fine. That this is, our brains can tolerate the variation, and you could have them both be unmarked as variants of singular they, a reflexive form of singular they. And we have some of these. It's interesting where we notice them and where we don't. So I know that there are some copy editors who feel strongly about this, but a lot don't. The difference between proved and proven. So that's a place where you actually will see variation, but in the past participle, and we're fine.
Right.
You get dive dove in terms of past tense. You have some, I have to say, the New York Times style guide as of 2015 was still holding on to the idea that the only past tense of dive was dived, which is remarkable that they're still holding on to that. But that's a place where, again, we could just allow unmarked variation. It's what happens in the spoken language is people say dived and people say dove, and we're fine. And we could allow more of that in the written as well. Yeah,
I like that dive dove example, because it goes back forever as a variant. And people say in speech, it's not something you even think about if they use dove instead of dived. Actually, maybe it's the opposite. You would note it if they said dived, then you would say, oh, you're speaking correctly. But in terms of understanding, there's no difference there. So
right.
interesting.
Or, one of the examples I use a lot is sneaked and snuck. Again, these places where we're happily creating an irregular verb. And what I love about snuck, which is very American, Brits will identify that as very American to use snuck as a past tense, is that unlike dove, where you can see the analogy, so you have drive, drove, dive, dove, there, as far as I can tell, and I have posed this to many classes of undergraduates, there is no good analogy for snuck. So you have sneak, snuck, you have peek, peeked. You don't have exactly that vowel variation.
So do we know how that originated?
I don't know how it originated. It's relative. It's a 20th century phenomenon in American English. And I also use it just to say, sometimes people will ask me or try to argue that languages always move toward regularity. And I say, except when they don't. So, you can have these little examples like or they move toward efficiency or something like that. I'm like, but here you had a regular verb that we happily made irregular. And then if you think about the history of the language, if you want a stunning example of inefficiency, it is what I would call the paraphrastic do or the dummy do, where earlier you could say, I know not. And then we have this change in the language where we have to insert a do, which does nothing other than hold on to the not, so that you say, I don't know. And that's why we call it a dummy do, a paraphrastic do. It does no work other than serving as a grammatical placeholder for negation or yes, no questions. So you can't say, know you the time? You have to say, do you know the time? This was an incredibly inefficient development in the history of the language, but that's fine. It's just the way language works. But I like to have those counterexamples when people say, it streamlines over time, except when it does not.
Except when it doesn't. Yeah, excellent. I lost my train of thought. So sorry. So let me go to what I warned you about, where we had a meeting of our patrons, people who support the show, and it was fun, a little holiday party, and somebody suggested that we do what some magazines and other venues do, and do sort of a lightning round of questions. So I have some lightning round questions submitted by one of our patrons. Most of these are from Kate Karp. Thank you, Kate. And here we go. So quick answer, you can't really think about it. And hopefully we'll learn something about you through the process.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah. When you look under your bed or in a dark closet, what are you afraid you'll see?
That my cat has missed her litter box.
Good. And then maybe the next one then is already answered. What smells elicit an irrational response from you?
I really don't like the smell of steamed broccoli.
Okay, I can identify with that, but like it's for me, it's like day old broccoli. I find with the steamed broccoli, it's like the next day.
No, it's steamed broccoli.
Right away. Can't, yeah. Okay, good. What meme or idea would you wear on your charm bracelet or get tattooed on your shoulder, I suppose?
Ooh, I know I'm supposed to go fast. Something like be mindful.
Oh, good. I like that. And what's your favorite word? And two parts of the question, orally, spoken word, and then also the word to write out if there's a difference.
Well, so I have an absolute favorite word. It is recombobulate. It's the best. So if you all could take away one thing, it would be this word, if you could help me make it happen. So it was voted by the American Dialect Society as the most creative word of the year back in like in the late 90s or the early 2000s. It comes from the Milwaukee airport, where after you go through security, they have a little area and it's called the recombobulation area, which is where you put your belt back on and you recombobulate having gone through security. And I think this is the best word because I have to recombobulate several times a day. After I teach and I have my stuff all over the front of the room, I have to recombobulate before I leave the room. It's such a good word. So that's my favorite word.
Yes, and I've seen that. I think Portland does that too. The airport. I could be wrong on this, but the recombobulation area, and it's terrific when we have an ACES conference in the town and people, everyone takes pictures of it because they're so excited about seeing that word in use.
Yes, and Melissa, I think you're right. It's got to be early 2000s because it's post 2001.
The recombobulation area, right?
Yep.
Right. What's your quiet place? Your getaway?
Swimming.
Swimming. Okay, where do you swim?
Well, I mostly at pools indoor and out, and I've been an athlete my whole life. And I took up swimming in my 20s. I find it the most peaceful, meditative experience. All I can hear is my own breathing. It is my Zen. It is my Zen space.
Excellent. All right, that's the end of our
Those are
lightning
great
round. Thank you.
questions.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think they're terrific, and I think thank you for being our first victim of the lightning round here in that word chat. We have a question from the room if Heather has it
We
lined up.
do. It's from our very own Karen Wise.
Hi, Anne. Back at the St. Petersburg conference, whatever it was, that 2015, did we say? Yeah.
17.
In your keynote, you mentioned you were either planning to have or already having your students compile sort of a slang dictionary of some sort, and you sort of hinted that we would have access to that eventually, and I'm waiting. Any chance that that's happening?
So that's interesting. So I don't, I compile a couple things with students. One is slang. So they teach me slang every day before class. And the other thing, and I wonder if this is what is, we have created etiquette guides for texting. And this is where I learn things like the period is angry and the winky face is always flirty, and these important things that I did not know, and it makes you completely rethink how you've been texting.
Maybe that was it, texting.
Yeah, so I have a sort of PDF of that. I haven't been able to update it with students in a couple of years. So I share it informally, but not formally. So if you drop me an email, I am happy to send it to you.
Okay, you can expect a bunch of emails, I think, from this group.
Thank you. Maybe you can post it to
I was going to say,
Heather.
actually, Mark,
Heather.
why don't, it might be easier if Mark or Heather, if you just send me an email, I'll send it to you, and then you can circulate it as you will.
We've got a
Sure.
resource newsletter just built for this kind of thing.
Excellent. We'll do that. So what is the latest? I was going to ask you this because I don't know. So you're a dean. You're a muckety muck at University of Michigan. Do you teach, or is that sort of are you able to get into the classroom?
I do still. I try to make sure I teach every year because I love teaching. I love being with students, and how else am I going to know what's going on with the language except to hang out with them? So last fall, I co-taught a course called Epic Grammar Fails. It was a 100 level class. It was such a hoot. Fundamentally, the question was who gets to decide what's right and wrong about language. So we got to talk about dictionaries and grammar books and all kinds of different registers of language. It was 150 students. We had a fantastic time. I learn, some of you may know, you've got a slang word that I like right now is low key. There's also high key. But many of us know low key as in casual. It'll be a low key party, but it's used now also to mean a couple things. One is only sort of, as in I'm low key stressed. So I'm stressed. I'm not high key stressed, which would be the other option. Or I had a student in my office a couple of years ago who was setting up a tripod because she was going to do a video. And as she was setting it up, one of the legs broke, and she's just talking to herself, and she's like, oh, I low-key broke it. Because it wasn't totally broken. It was just low-key broken. But the other thing it can mean is secretly or on the down low. So you'll hear students say, I'm low-key into him. So I'm interested, but not openly.
I'm curious that how many people knew that, because that's not something, I think whenever I do ask somebody about what they're hearing when I talk to colleagues who are in the classroom, I'm always surprised by some of the new stuff and somehow clever and creative it can be.
Absolutely. And that, Mark, I think is such an important message. And it's why I ask students to teach me slang before class every day, is to affirm that they are the movers and shakers of language, and that the words that they're coming up with are creative and playful and smart. Many of them won't last, which is totally fine. And some of them will. But young people get so much messaging that they are ruining the language, that they don't care about language, that they're destroying it, whatever verb people use that's saying that they're ruining it. And I feel like my job is to say, no, you are changing it, you're playing with it, you're doing beautiful, fun things with it, and you will win. That is one of the other messages, is the fact that young people say on accident and I say by accident means that I lose, because they are going to outlive me. And by accident, and I would guess many of the people here are by accident speakers, we are soon going to be outnumbered by on accident speakers. And prepositions change, and that one's changing. And my brother-in-law, of course, in response is like, I'm going to start saying by purpose. Like, well, you do that.
Good luck with that. Yeah. Yeah. You're not a college student who can maybe have that influence. We don't have the influence anymore after a point. Do you
And
say
I see people noting some other things like based off. Absolutely, that's happening. Based on is still way more common, but based off is definitely happening. And on accident is not regional, it is generational.
Right.
In
Is that
American.
and that's something that's interesting, brings up an interesting point. Are we seeing more? Obviously, we always see generational change, but are we seeing more universal change with Twitter, with other sort of common media, or are we still getting strong regionalisms?
So here's my take, which is that we don't know the answer to that yet. I think internet technologies are new enough that we don't yet know the impact of them on language change. There are things that can happen now that are really surprising. So a word, for example, can go viral in minutes around the world. That's really new. That is something that we just simply have never seen in the history of a language. And it's not just true of English, it's true of other languages as well. We're also getting contact of languages with each other that at a scale that we've never seen. But there also are certainly people who study American dialects would say that the evidence right now is that regionalisms, American dialects are getting stronger, not weaker. That people do in the end want to show a sense of place and a sense of community. So that would be regional dialects, it would be social dialects, that people, we don't all want to sound the same. We want to sound like the communities that we identify with, and that the globalization of some things may actually push us toward more specificity of community in how we use language. So I would say we're still figuring it out.
Right. There's still that strong desire to identify with a group, and
Absolutely.
certainly with the young people, it's that shared language. But I want to go back to the beginning. We talked about emails, and I'm curious how that has changed, because it was interesting what you said. People take forever. They say they take forever to compose an email, and I feel like email has become less a formal letter and more a conversation thing. So have you noticed that trend toward how people compose their emails to you?
Well, so what the undergraduates would say is email is old school, period. They don't use email. They use texting, Instagram, Facebook. They are Twitter. You know, I spend a lot of time as a teacher and as the dean saying, you got to check your email. Important announcements are coming out over email. You got to check your email. So, I mean, they see it as very institutional. And so I think for people my age, we use it both ways. We will use it in more formal ways where you get the dear, blah, 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 and you sign it and all those sorts of things. And then you get sometimes the quick back and forth where it looks a little bit more like texting, but it's happening on email. My sense is that with younger people, email is only institutional. and mostly they're receiving and not using. They're not sending.
Yeah.
And then they're doing most of their communication on IM and not IM, but texting and Instagram.
Mhm.
And I will say, I mean, for many of you, and I would guess in workplaces now, people are using things like Slack, which is where a lot of the more conversational stuff is happening. Now, I'm fascinated by this really conversational language in writing, because this is where, and this is the etiquette guide with students, this is where we have had to, and young people in particular, have repurposed punctuation in particular, but also using it to be able to do tone and facial expression, because you're working in a written medium. And so you need the period to be angry and the exclamation mark to be showing that you're happy and not angry, and smiley faces and JK and all that kind of stuff, because it's moving fast without tone or facial expression. So I'm really interested in the adaptations to the written language that are happening here. And I will just end by saying, this is where, again, for everybody who's willing to, it is a place to affirm young people. Because when I create an etiquette guide with them and they are teaching me about texting punctuation, what they're so struck by is how intricate a system it is. It is nuanced, it is specific. They completely agree on the difference between okay, period, okay, no punctuation, and okay, ... They are like, those are totally different. We are well aware of the differences. We can explain them in an etiquette guide. And their reputation, older people will say, you know, young people with texting, they don't care about language. They don't care about punctuation. It's sloppy. It's not. It's a different system. They are repurposing things to do particular kinds of work. And it's just that you may not know the system. And so they will say, I feel like my mom's always angry because she puts periods at the end of her text. I know she's not, but they reads as angry. And they're like, and I know it's because she doesn't know.
Yeah. I have a habit of using the full sentence, using the periods, avoiding the exclamation points. And I think my kids are 20 and 30, and they're okay with that. They understand that, but it's interesting. It's fascinating to watch. And like you say, it's affirming to the young generation that these are not sloppy. These are thought out, purposeful changes. We're sloppy when we simply end everything with a period without giving any emotion or any further information to it. So.
Yeah, and I see people with the KK, which is the friendly way of saying okay. And just in case you did not know this, I would guess many of you did, that if you write K period, that is the end of a relationship. That is, and students are, you say K period and their eyes get really wide. They're just like, oh, no, that's bad. That's really bad.
All right, well, so what's next? What's emerging? What are we going to see? What's the next big thing in linguistics and language change?
Oh gosh, keep your eye on pronouns. A lot of activity going on with pronouns. Me and my mom went, and between you and I, this subject object, both in conjoined constructions and outside them, this is the eventual collapse of the nominative accusative, subject object distinction in the pronoun system. It's going to take a long time, but that's what we're seeing there. So that's ongoing. A lot of changes in modals. So must, in the sense of obligation, is on its way out because HAFTA is coming in to replace it. Shall, unsurprisingly, not so healthy. Gonna is now well established. And if we didn't have such standardized spelling, we would just let it be GONNA because that's what it wants to be. So those are a couple areas to watch, but it's such fun, right? An endless number of things to pay attention to.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic hour. So much we covered and talked about, and such interesting stuff. Thank you all for being here. We're going to be back in a month. We do a monthly show now, so 4 weeks. It's February, so it'll be the first again of next month. And we've got, where's the book? I filed it. I know it's in there somewhere. We have the greatest title, I think, of a language book this year is probably going to be Index, A History of the. And we have the author of that on our next show coming to us from England. And we're going to talk all about indexes. And so tell all your indexing friends to tune in next month. Thank you, Aaron Brenner, for all you've done for that word chat. And thank you, Anne Curzan. It's been so much fun. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And we
My
will see
pleasure.
you. We'll see you in 4 weeks.
Thank you all for coming. And I found the cover, found the book. It was hiding behind Han Solo here. Dennis Duncan, Index, A History of the. So we'll see you next month. Thanks so much, everybody.